Today in English Language Arts, we're going to be understanding supporting evidence. So we're going to be using details from the passage to support reasons why we choose specific answers. And that's nothing that we haven't done previously. We're just doing it in a lesson now for lesson 19. So our learning target says understanding the reasons and evidence an author uses to support points will help you better understand a text. When you're reading informational text, look for the point the author presents to convince you an idea is true. To figure out whether an author's points are supported, look for any reasons and evidence he or she supplies for each point. A reason is an explanation for why the idea might be true. A piece of evidence is a fact that can be proven true. In the comic strip below, identify the reasons and evidence the girl gives for needing a secret code. So the little boy says, "Hey, want to go outside?" She says, "Can't. I'm developing a code for secret messages." He says, "Why do you need that?" She says, "It's my brother. He keeps reading my diary." He says, "He does? What's your evidence?" She says, "Well, my diary keeps moving around my room. I keep finding it open. And he keeps telling me to write more neatly." "Oh, if it's not a problem. Only if it's not a problem." Who do we think this little guy is? That's probably her brother, huh? She's saying, "Oh, only if it's not a problem," like only if it's not a problem that you write more neatly. All right, so now we're going to go to the chart on the following page, and we are going to think about what we have learned about the points, reasons, and evidence, and complete the chart for the comic strip that we just read. So, what does the girl think? She thinks she needs a secret code. Why does she think that she needs a secret code? Well, she thinks that she needs a secret code because she thinks her brother is reading her diary. Her little brother keeps reading her diary. And what evidence supports her thinking? It moves around the room, she gets notes saying to write more neatly, and she finds it open. Her diary keeps moving around the room, she keeps finding it open, her brother tells her to write more neatly. So all three of those evidences support that her little brother must be reading her diary, which is why she must need the secret code. If you need to pause the video to get those written down, you can pause the video at this time. Going on to the power of codes on the next page, our closed reader habit says when you read the article, underline examples that show how secret codes are related both to keeping and losing power. Secret codes and power go hand in hand. Why is this so? Because a code lets one group of people communicate information in a way that keeps it secret from other groups. The group that knows the code has an advantage over the group that doesn't. Take the example of Julius Caesar, an emperor of ancient Rome who conquered much of Europe and northern Africa. Caesar used letters to communicate his military plans to faraway generals. But what if an opposing army obtained copies of his letters? His plans might be foiled. So Caesar developed a code. That only he and trusted members of his army understood. If an enemy intercepted Caesar's letters, they would not understand them or be able to prepare for his plan. The code gave Caesar an advantage over his opponents, letting him keep and increase his power. So remember, our reader habit says to underline examples that show how secret codes are related to both keeping and losing power. So Caesar develops a code. It's an advantage because only he and his people know it, and so his opponents don't know the code. So that is one way that Caesar can keep his power. Not all codes were as successful as Caesar's, however. In the 1500s, when Elizabeth I was Queen of England, her cousin Mary plotted to overthrow her. Mary communicated with her allies through coded messages. However, Mary's code was easy to crack, so her plan was discovered. If Mary had used a better code, she might have risen to power as the Queen of England. So this is how she was not able to take over power, because her code wasn't a good one, because it wasn't strong enough, and so the Queen of England was able to decipher the code and know what her plan was. And finally, in the last paragraph, or the last two paragraphs, codes remain important to modern times. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, German submarines communicated in code so complicated that was nearly unbreakable. But a brilliant Englishman named Alan Turing cracked the German code. Now that the English knew when and where a British ship would be targeted, they could fight back. When the Germans' code was broken, they lost a powerful advantage. So here's another example of losing power because the Germans' code wasn't as successful. Secret codes aren't just about power, of course. It's fun to develop a code to communicate in secrets. But when rulers and enemies use codes, they're not doing so for fun. For them, it's serious business. Now we're going to use that article to fill in the chart on the next page. So it says, the author states, secret codes and power go hand in hand. Complete the chart to explain why the author thinks this and describe 3 pieces of evidence supporting this thinking. So, what does the author think? Secret codes and power go hands in hand. Why does he think this? Why does he think that secret messages and power go hand in hand? Well, he thinks that because everything that's happened in history. Historically, a group has had an advantage if it has had a code that keep information secret from other groups. Groups that have their codes broken no longer have the advantage. So because history has shown him when secret codes are kept, you get to keep your power, and when they're broken, you don't get to keep their power, that's why he thinks secret codes and power go hand in hand. What evidence supports that? Well, it's the 3 things that happened in history. When Julius Caesar had the code, Mary and the Queen of England, and who was that last guy? Oh, the German code. So our evidence, Julius Caesar used secret code in letters to his generals. Elizabeth I held on to her power because Mary's coded letters were too easy to figure out. So Mary didn't have a strong secret code. And then after Alan Turing cracked the German code, the British knew when their ships were targeted. So those are 3 examples from history that show power and secret codes go hand in hand. The last one on this page is a short response. It says, the author states that a group with a secret code has an advantage over groups that do not. Explain how the author supports this idea. Use details from the passage in your response. Use the space on page 342 to write your answer. We're going to turn to page 342 and see a sample answer. We're basically going to use what is in this diagram right here, in this table, to write our sample answer. So on page 342, this is a sample. You don't have to have this exact same answer, but it can be something similar. So Alan Kim, that's the author, uses examples from history to support his idea that a group with a secret code has an advantage over groups that do not. One example is Julius Caesar, who used a code to describe his plans to a member of his army. It would not matter if Caesar's enemies intercepted his letters, because they would not be able to understand what they said. This gave Caesar an advantage over his enemies. A second example is the work of Alan Turing, who cracked a German code that conveyed messages about submarine warfare. Because Turing cracked that code, the Germans lost a big advantage over the British in World War II. So those examples and its details from the story support that the author is using history to say that people with a secret code have advantages over those that do not. If you need to pause the video to get that down, go ahead and do so. To continue on page 340, the slave quilt code, fact or fiction. Our closed reader habit here says, how does the author support the idea that quilts played no special role in the Underground Railroad? Underline any information supporting this idea. So we're looking for information that supports that quilts did not play an important role in the Underground Railroad. Back in the 1900s, an intriguing idea arose. People began claiming that during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, African slaves in the southern states used a secret code to help one another escape north to freedom. This code consisted of patterns sewn into quilt blocks by slave women. For example, a pattern called wagon wheel meant to quickly load up a wagon and prepare to head north, and a pattern called shoe fly signaled that a friendly guide waited nearby to help. Such quilts helped runaway slaves make their way along a network of routes known as the Underground Railroad to freedom. Films and books sprang up about how these bed covers with their secret messages sewn by slave women saved lives and led enslaved people to freedom. The popular Oprah Winfrey TV show even featured these claims and stories. The public loved these thrilling accounts of adventures from America's past. But wait, how true were they? These quilt codes accounts were exciting, yes, and people wanted them to be historically accurate. But were they? Many historians have studied slavery and the Underground Railroad. These historians reviewed the evidence. None of it appears to come directly from the slaves, they concluded. There were no letters and no news articles quoting the slaves themselves. It all came from stories passed along by word of mouth, and none of the quilts used to help runaway slaves could be found. So that information there all supports that it was the quilts did not play an important role. So that is why that's underlined, because that's our closed reader habit. Still, many books were written concerning these oral accounts, exciting stories of secret hiding places, life-threatening encounters, and midnight escapes. But there were no documents to back up these quilt code claims. Based on the lack of strong evidence, we must conclude the quilts played no special role in the Underground Railroad. Now we're going to use this information to answer the questions on the following page. The first question says, how does the author support the idea that people wanted to believe African slaves in the South used a secret code? A, by showing that history of the quilt code wasn't known before the 1990s and then it became a popular topic. B, by showing that experts believed the quilt's patterns had different meanings and gave signals to escaping slaves. C, by showing that the slave quilt codes were related to Underground Railroad, which is an interesting topic. Or D, by showing that the stories about the quilt codes were the subject of popular books, films, and shows. So it should be letter D. Letter D shows it supports that people wanted to believe African American slaves used that secret code because it was made into popular book shows and films. Part B, which detail from the article supports the answer that we chose in Part A? The popular Oprah Winfrey TV show even featured these claims. Many historians have studied slavery and the Underground Railroad. It all came from stories passed along by word of mouth, or there were no documents to back up these quilt code claims. So A supports that they were stories were in popular books, films, and shows because it says the popular Oprah Winfrey TV show even featured it. We are now going to answer the short response on page 343. How does the author support the idea about quilts not having secret messages? Provide two examples of evidence for the author Provide two examples of the evidence the author uses to support the ideas. Use the space provided on 343 to write your answer. So on page 343, we're going to fill in this chart, much like we did for the previous story. What does the author think? He thinks that the quilts being used for secret codes for the slaves to escape through the Underground Railroad was false. Why does he think this? Because there's nothing documenting that they were used for that. And what evidence does he support, or what evidence does he use to support his thinking? He says that There were no articles or documents with accounts from personal testimonies from the slaves themselves about using the quilts, and none of the quilts could be found. So there was no evidence that could be found that supported that these quilts were actually used. So after you fill in your chart, you're going to take what's in your chart and write it in a paragraph format. So here is a sample paragraph. Ron Friedel, that was the Arthur, concludes, quilts played no special role in the Underground Railroad. To support his conclusion, Friedel states that historians who studied the Underground Railroad have found no concrete evidence, such as the quilts themselves. Friedel also states that historians found no letters or news articles, including quotes from enslaved or escaped people about such quilts. Lacking evidence in the form of either quilts or documents, the author believes that we cannot assume the quilts with secret codes played a role in the Underground Railroad. So if you have any questions about today's lesson, please send me an email.